Welcome back. We are sliding today with our slider web interaction component we are working on. We have our left and right navigation, which is working great for pointing devices, particularly with a mouse. You would typically expect to have controls like this to go back and forth. However, if you are on a touch screen, and in particular, if we open up Chrome's device toolbar, so you can see this button to open the device toolbar, you can kind of interact with your application as if you are a touchscreen user. So I am using the iPad preset and you can click this button to get it into landscape mode. And then you can kind of see it gives you this little circle as opposed to a mouse cursor that is still going to allow those touchscreen users to utilize these buttons. That's going to work just fine. But a lot of times you may want to introduce this idea of swiping into this style content where you kind of have a horizontal row of content that you can swipe through, or maybe you're just building a totally separate component and you just want to have some sort of swiping functionality. You want to be able to introduce that into your application. It's very common in many different components to introduce the idea of a swipe. So that's going to be what we're doing in this lesson is we're going to add some event listeners that are specific to touch devices and touch interfaces that are going to allow us to kind of change the way our slider works whenever you have users interacting with it in this fashion. So basically the way a swipe works in a web application when you're creating a component like this is you need to record sort of like our drag and drop. If you remember from our sortable, when you drag and drop, you kind of record the drag start event, then you record the drag over event, and then finally you have a drag end event. It's very, very similar with a swipe or touch events in that we're going to record a touch start event, a touch move event, and a touch end event. These are three different event listeners that we can add to our component. And basically what we can do is when we have touch start, we can say, did you start your touch on an element we care about, meaning one of these slides within our slider? And if so, let's start recording the position at which you touched. And then if you drag to the left, for example, we can say, okay, on touch move, let's compare your new position of your touch to the old position. And if you move to the left, then let's move our slider to the left. If you move to the right, then we move our slider to the right. And then on touch end, that means you lifted your finger, and that means that you let go. Let's see where you let go. And if you pulled enough to the left, then let's swipe to the right, just like you would click on the button. That's basically how your touch events work, is you're going to listen to those three different events. You kind of compare, in this case, the X position of those touch events, and then you see, okay, how far did you move? And we want to give feedback to the user that they're actually swiping, and it creates this really nice interface where rather than interacting with controls, you're interacting with the content itself, right? I'm not clicking a button to make this move left and right. I'm grabbing the slide and I'm moving it with my touch left and right. And it just makes it a lot more tactile, and it's going to make a much better experience and a much better interface for those touchscreen users. So let's take a look at that. Inside of our slider script here, what we're going to do is in our init method, where we are adding our event listeners. Currently, we only have the click listener for our left and right buttons. What we're going to do is we're going to add some new listeners here. So we're going to add document.add event listener. And then if you type in touch, you'll see there's 4 different touch events. You can read about them here. But again, like I mentioned, we're going to be recording touch start, touch move, and touch end. Those are the 3 that we care about. So let's begin with touch start. We'll capture that event and we'll pass it to this.touch start. We'll create an event called that. And then let's do the same thing for touch move. Let me make sure that's right. If we take away the quotes, we can get our IntelliSense back. So touch move, and then we'll create an event called touch move. And then finally, there is touch end, like so. So we're going to need to create these 3 methods. They're going to accept a touch event. So let's go down to the bottom of our method here. Right below our click listener, we'll create a new listener for touch start, which will accept an event. Whoops. And so this is going to be a touch event. I believe. Let me hover over that. Yep, you can see the tooltip. So that's a touch event, represents an event which has touch sensitive surface changes or whatever. And this is different. Touch events are very different from all the other events like keyboard events and mouse events and drag events that we've worked with before, because touches are a little more complex. So let's take a look at this. This will be the touch start event. And this is the touch start listener. So first of all, let's just console.log e whenever you are capturing a touch start. And I'm going to need to, so we don't get an error, I'm going to need to add a touch move. And let's not console log that because that's going to get crazy. And this will be a touch move listener, like so. And then we have touch end, which will be, of course, a touch end listener. Touch is one of those words where if you type it over and over, you read it over and over, it starts to look like weird. Maybe that's just me. Does that ever happen? Or if you look at a word too much, it just doesn't look like it's right. That's what I'm feeling now about the word touch. But anyway, so we added the console log to touch start. And then you'll notice here, if we clear our console, and we have this device toolbar open. We're in iPad landscape mode. And if you're a little circle thing, your cursor disappears, which you can see right here, it turned back into an arrow. I just go up and like kind of hover over stuff and then come back and it magically appears. Maybe that's just me. That just happens a bunch. But that's why you might see me come up here and like highlight and then come back. I'm just trying to get this little circle thing to appear because I think it looks nicer. But anyway, so if I just start and click, you'll notice we have a touch event. But if you look at the touch event, you do not have positional information on a touch event. You don't have client X, client Y, layer X, layer Y. You have an event.target, right? So I can see what element I touch, but you don't get any positional information on a touch event. And that's because a touch event can actually be an event that occurs with multiple pointers, meaning you could have gestures like where you have two fingers where you're scrolling up and down. You could have pinch and sort of those zoom gestures where you're doing pinching and spreading with multiple fingers. You could have any number of devices or pointers that are touching at any given time. So it's more like you can think of it as like a collection of touches, because technically you can have multiple fingers in a single touch event. And what they do is if you need positional information, you actually get this touches array, or this what's called a touch list, which is kind of like an array. And you'll see in this case, we have a single touch that occurred. And if we look at that, that's what has our positional information in it. Client X, client Y, page X, page Y, etc. So this is kind of how you're going to have to deal with touch events, is you need to think of it as almost like an array. You can have multiple touches, and you need to think about how you want users to interact with this. If I put two fingers and I scroll left and right, do I still want it to do the same thing? So, or do I only want this to occur on a single finger swipe? So you can kind of differentiate between that using these touch events. But what we can do now in our listener is, first of all, on touch start, let's just decide that, hey, we don't want to do anything if there's more than one touch, because we decide that, hey, they're probably trying to scroll. Like a two finger touch is usually like I'm scrolling up and down. So let's not do anything if there's more than one touch. So we'll say not a single touch if e.touches, again, which is a touch list, .length is not equal to 1, then let's simply return. So that's the first thing to do. Make sure it's a single finger touch. And then second, we need to make sure that you actually touch something that we care about. Because again, this is a global touch start listener. So you could be performing a touch on the nav bar or on some other element in the page. So let's make sure that this matches. So let's say not a data slider touch. So if e.target.matches, and actually we want if it doesn't match, some selector, which will be this.config.attr or this.config.attr space star, then let's simply return. And then now that we've verified that you actually perform the touch inside of a data slider, let's load slider state. So this.load state e.target. which is verified to be inside of a data slider. So that's good. And then, like I said, what we want to do on touch start is we want to sort of record the position of the touch so that later when we are moving around in touch move, we can say, okay, we started this touch at X position 100, let's say. But then we moved to negative 100, meaning we moved 200 pixels to the left. So that means let's grab our slider and move it to the left because we moved that much. So we kind of want to make sure in this touch start event that we record the X position that we started at. And then let's later in touch move, we'll kind of move the slider around based on how far we've gone. So now that we've loaded the slider state, we're going to want a new state property that we can save. And we can maybe call this the starting position or the start. So let's go up into where we initialize our state. That is up here in our init method. You'll see this.state equals, and let's add a new start, which is gonna initially be a 0, or we can even set it to undefined perhaps, just to make sure that it's not set initially. And that's gonna record the starting position of our touch events. And now that we have that in our state, in our start method, our touch start method that's down here, let's go ahead and record starting X position. So this.state.start is equal to e.touches of 0, because we want to get the, we verified that there's only one touch in e.touches. And then we're going to get the screen X position. And again, there's a lot of different ways you can measure stuff: screen X, screen Y, page X, page Y, client X, client Y. And a lot of those have to do with like when you're scrolled, it could potentially have an offset. And you kind of need to read through the MDN documentation on how those work. But if we're using screen space, it's going to be really easy because even if I scroll left and right, it's not going to change because this is relative to the screen. And it's not going to be relative to where we're scrolled or relative to the offset of some element. It's just going to be nice and consistent, even if I did some weird scrolling or something in the middle of the touch itself. So we're going to measure in screen space. So we're going to save e.touches, the first touch. We're going to save the screen X to this.state.start. And then let's sort of do the same thing down here. In our touch move, we'll say not a single touch, so we don't care about it. We'll immediately return. And what we'll do for now is we'll simply say console.log sliding, and then we'll add some number, which will be e.touches of 0.screenx minus this.state.start. So this is going to show us like the difference in where we're sliding. And again, the touch move, just like the drag over event, is going to be one of those events that fires off very, very rapidly in rapid succession. So you need to be concerned about performance here. But you'll see if we watch the console, it's basically going to show us, it's probably might see an error or two because it's weird the way I implemented this. But anyway, so if I start right here and I drag to the left, you can see as I'm moving left, that number is going up. So I can see I've moved 451 pixels from the start of my touch. If I drag back to the right, it's going to go back down, and I can see I'm about at 0, so I'm about at the same position I started. If I drag to the right, it's going to be positive, and I can see I've dragged 316 pixels to the right. So it's kind of showing me in touch move how far I've moved from our starting position. And in order to get this to properly work the way we want, I think we're going to need a couple new state variables that we can save in state. And in particular, what I want to do first of all is I want to track whether we are like sort of touch sliding at any given time, because I want to be able to first of all say, are we sliding on touch move? If not, then let's immediately return. Right, so that's kind of important, is we need to know the state of like, are we swiping left and right? I guess that would be a good term to use, is are we swiping? So let's go up into our state and our init when we initialize this, and let's add a new property here called swiping, which is going to be false by default. And whenever you have initiated a touch on the slider, let's start swiping, so that'll be switched to true, and then when you end your touch, that'll go back to false, so that we know we can stop caring about our touch moves. So that way, down here in our touch start, we will set swiping, this.state.swiping equals true. So we'll make sure that we start swiping on touch start, and then on touch move, we can say not swiping, if this.state.swiping is false, then simply return. So we don't have to do any calculation or anything if we're not actively swiping, or if this is a touch move that's maybe fired from some other element. Maybe you were dragging, sort of dragging or sliding, dragging up and down or something like that. Maybe just scrolling. We want to make sure that we can immediately return out of this because, again, it's one of those methods that's going to fire off really, really often. So we've checked that here. Also in our touch end, we need to make sure we're not swiping. So this dot state.swiping equals false. Whoops, swiping. There we go. And so we're setting that back to false on touch end. And then that means, you'll see here, we can swipe. It's going to show us that move thing. But if I swipe like up here, you're not going to see anything logged in the console. If I swipe down here, nothing is going to be logged. Even if I like start my touch down here and I drag over the slider, it's not going to do anything because it knows we never initiated, we never started swiping anywhere. Even on the button right here, it's not going to do anything because it knows I'm hitting a button. So it's not going to allow me to swipe left and right there. But anywhere on the slide, I can see that I'm swiping. And that's what you want. You want your touch events to be sort of connected to the content. And that's the big difference between a touch interface and a pointer interface, is that typically in a touch interface, the fingers or the touches are interacting with content directly as opposed to interacting with controls, which that's what we're very used to in the world of pointing devices like a mouse. Is you have buttons to do everything, right? You click on this button and it does something. In the touch world, however, you'll notice a lot of apps and a lot of interfaces are designed around direct content manipulation. So you grab the content and you move it around, you swipe it and you do stuff like that. And that's why we kind of have to learn how to do this in this web interaction world of lots of touch screens, because a lot of users are going to expect to interact with things in that fashion. So how do we actually make use of this now that we're recording these events? Well, what we can do is we can have a new state variable that's basically going to be the distance from start. So let's go up to our init method where we have state, and we'll set a new property here. Maybe we'll just call this swiping distance, which will initially be 0. So that's going to be a number. That's going to be the distance, and then we can just update that on touch move. So let's go back to our touch move down here, and we will say update state, this.state.swiping distance is equal to this value right here. And now that we are updating that on touch move, what we can do is we can basically update our state, and our state can take into account the swiping distance, right? So on touch move, we will set state, this.set state. But then in our set state method, if we go to this, currently it's only taking into account our index to set the left position of the slider. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this.state.index times -100, but we're also going to add our swiping distance onto this. So plus this.state.swiping distance. And you'll see what that does is now I can now grab this and I can move it left and right. That's pretty cool, right? Now it's moving way too fast at the moment. And why do you guys think that is? I'm going to give you a moment to sort of think about that in your head. Why is it moving way too fast? Well, that's because we are currently adding a pixel value onto a percentage, right? So when I move 300 pixels to the right, it's actually moving at 300% to the right, which is way too much. So what we actually need to do is we need to kind of calculate the width. We need to calculate a percentage basically based on the width of our slider itself. And this is something I want to do not really often, because again, this could be like sort of performance intensive, because we're going to want to measure the width of an element. And the way I want to handle this is, let's go to the load state method. And every time you load state, so we're finding the slider container, we're finding the slider, we're getting its length, we're getting the current slider index. Let's measure slider width as well. And let's save that to a new state property. We can just call this this.state.width equals, some value, some number. But this will be the pixel width of our slider itself. And then that way we can kind of divide the pixels that we've moved, the swiping distance, by the slider's width to get a percentage. And that's exactly what we want. So let's go up to our init method and make sure we add that. Let's add a width, which will initially be 0. Let's just set it to undefined, because I don't necessarily want it to be 0. But we have our width here that's now saved inside of state. And then now every time we load state, let's set this.state.width. And we'll set that to this.state.slider container. So we're going to get our container element, which goes around everything. And we're going to do .get bounding, I don't remember, get bounding rectangle. Let's search for that real quick. I'm sure there's an MDN article. There is. Get bounding client rect. So you can see what this does is it gives you a lot of cool, do they have a description of the property here? Yeah, right here. So it has read-only properties. You call this on any HTML element that's in the DOM, and it's going to give you the left, top, right, bottom, X, Y, width, and height. And there's some weirdness with the browser support. Thanks a lot, Edge and Internet Explorer. They don't have the X and the Y, but that's fine. We don't need that in this case. I'm only concerned about the width, which is supported pretty much across the board. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this get bounding client rectangle. So we're on the slider container every time we get this. We're going to say .get bounding client rect. And then that's going to return, as you see in the tooltip, we're not typed here, so it's not going to give us a lot of information, but we can basically say .width, and that's going to give us the width of the slider container in pixel value. So let me just show you console.log this.state.width. If we set that, you'll see in the console, let me refresh, it's going to give us 800 because right now the slider container is exactly 800 pixels wide. So now I have a pixel width of our overall slider container. Every time we're loading state, I'm going to have that information. So this.state.width is where that is stored. And now we can do a quick calculation when we set state by taking our swiping distance, and we can divide that by this.state.width, which is going to create a number between 0 and 1. So we want to take that and multiply that by 100. So that's going to be times 100. And that should give us a percentage value of the swiping distance. The swiping distance, again, is a pixel value. So we're basically, all we're doing here is converting this to a percentage. And now when we grab this and we move left and right, you'll see it's going to be much slower. It's actually moving based on a percentage, which is working much better. Now it's a little weird. You'll notice it's a little weird with the animation there, and that's because we currently have a transition. So even though we're moving left very quickly up here, it's actually appearing slower because it's trying to apply an animation or a transition while we slide that. So what you would typically want to do is in our set state method, if we are currently swiping, you want to remove, add or remove a class based on that state. So let's come down here and we'll set classes, this.state.slider.classList and then we're either going to add or remove. So this.state.swiping. And if that's true, we're going to add a class, otherwise remove it, called swiping. And you'll see if we look at the UL up here, you see it has a class of slides. But while we swipe, so while I hold down my mouse, we are swiping. If I let go, it should remove the class. Oh, and you know what? It's not removing it because in our touch end event, we're not calling set state. So let's make sure we do that. Let's go down to touch end, and we'll just copy this right here. Set state, like so. So you see it removes swiping as soon as I let go. So while we are swiping, we have the swiping class. When we remove it, it disappears. And then that way in our CSS, in our style sheet here, right here where we have the transition left, we can say when you're swiping, however, let's set transition to none. So we're kind of overriding the transition. So during a swipe, it's going to be very much controlled by the cursor. You can see how much faster and smoother that looks. But then when we go back to just like normal navigation, it's actually going to be much better. And this is acting a little bit weird right now because when you navigate, you can see here that's working great. But when you add a swiping distance, it's going to be offset, right? Which is kind of weird, and that kind of messes up our calculations. So it's probably also a good idea in our touch end to update. Well, let's actually just say update state here, and we'll say this dot state dot swiping distance is equal to 0 once you touch end. So you can grab it, you can let go, it's going to kind of snap back to its position, which is going to be much better in this case. And that kind of feels like a swipe, right? That's pretty cool. We're not actually navigating after the end of that swipe, which is something we're going to add next. But we've kind of added this feeling of being able to grab the content and pull it. And you let go and it kind of snaps back to its original position. And that feels pretty cool. That's like a neat interaction that we're now doing using these touch events in our interaction, in our web interactive component, which is pretty cool in my opinion. So finally, what I want to do is I want to say if you have pulled left or right enough, then let's navigate to either the previous or the next slide, respectively. That's kind of the last thing with these touch events, right? Is if I pull to the right and maybe if I just pull to there, we don't necessarily want to navigate. Maybe that just kind of springs back like it does here. But maybe if I pull far enough past some threshold that we set, maybe then I want to go ahead and navigate to the next slide. So that's kind of the next thing we want to add. We already have the ability to navigate between slides because in our click event here, you can see we have this load slider state, update the state. We're either increasing or decreasing and then setting the state. So maybe what we can do is we'll separate this out into its own method and we'll call this navigate. And let's paste that in. So that's going to need a target, or let's just call this L like we did in the other one. And this will take an HTML element L, which is the element from which to begin traversal, from which. And this will navigate slider forward or backwards, forwards or backwards. And this should also accept a parameter of type Boolean, which we'll set to forward, navigate forward. So let's add a default value forward equals true right here. So we'll kind of use this to determine whether you're going forward or backwards. So then we can say if you're going forward, let's actually do plus plus, otherwise do minus minus. Like so. So now we've kind of abstracted this out to its own little event. Let's make sure that still works. So we'll do navigate, this.navigate, and that's going to take an element, which will be e.target, as well as forward, which we'll just pass next click, right? Because that's going to be equal to whether or not we're going forward. So let's just make sure that this still works on the buttons, and it does. And now we can reuse this navigate method inside at the end of our swipe to basically say, hey, did you swipe far enough? If so, let's navigate forward or backwards. So that's going to be in our touch end event down here. So before we update our state, let's say console.log this.state.swiping distance. But I don't necessarily just want to navigate like when you have gone a certain number of pixels. I kind of want to do the same thing where we calculate the percentage, right? I want to say if you've swiped 10% or if you've swiped 30%, then navigate. I want to set some threshold. So rather than using the swiping distance, we'll calculate the percentage again, which we've already did in our set state method, right? That's way up here in set state. So basically this calculation right here is how we calculate the percentage. So since we're going to do that more than once, let's actually pull this out into its own method. So we'll just add this dot calculate, we'll say swiping distance percentage. So we'll create a method that'll just return that value, swiping distance percentage. So let's go down here. After navigate, we'll add swiping distance percentage. And that will return that calculation that we previously created. So it's going to take this .state.swiping distance, divide it by the width, and multiply that by 100. So this will return a number. And this is get swiping distance %, like so. So we have that calculation now in its own method. Again, let's make sure that this still works. It does indeed, by moving this to its own method. And now in our touch end, we could say get swiping distance, const distance equals this dot swiping distance %, like so. So that's going to give us our distance in % that we pulled left or we pulled right. And now what we can do is we can say if like the distance is greater than some threshold. So like we could say this .config.threshold maybe we create a new config value for that. Then let's this .navigate with e.target and, or actually we don't need e.target, we'll just do this .state.slider or even the slider container because that won't have to do any traversal there. And then the forward value will be true, right? If the distance is greater than the config threshold, else if the distance is less than, and we could even do greater than or equal to, that probably makes more sense, or less than or equal to this .config.threshold times -1. So if you've pulled to the left that same threshold, then let's navigate to the left. So we'll set forward to false in that case. And we'll just change this to swipe. So we need to make sure that we set this threshold configuration value. So let's give that a default value of like 30% or something like that. And then let's see if this works. We will find out. So if I pull this to the left only like 15%, it's just going to snap back. If I pull it more than 30%, it will not work because I don't know why. Let's find out. Let me just log out the distance here. Whoops. And we'll see what that equals. That seems right. Oh, I have it go in the opposite direction. That's the problem. So I had my directions messed up. So what we actually want is we want to say when it's positive, we go previous. When it's negative, like so, we go the other way. So I said it flipped it around in my silly head. So let's do greater than, or let's just switch these. Less than or equal to threshold times -1, and greater than or equal to the threshold. Navigate that way. So let's see if that works. So if we go over enough, it's actually going to snap to the next or the previous slide, respectively. And that's looking pretty good, right? We are swiping now. I would even change the threshold maybe to something like 20%. It feels like you have to pull it a little far. And that looks pretty good. We are swiping back and forth. If you pull it far enough, it'll actually snap to the closest one because, again, we are rounding to that, which is pretty cool. So we are swiping. We have created our swipe functionality. It's doing our animation. I can kind of even pull it all the way over if I want. For some reason, that just feels a little more springy. I like the interaction that we've created here. So we have used our touch events to wire up all of our functionality that we need to be able to grab and swipe our content left and right. We can alternatively use the pointing device. And then the interesting thing about the touch start and the touch move and the touch end events is if I leave this emulation mode, I go back to a normal pointer, right? I can grab my image and move it around. I can select my text. I'm not having to interfere with these events because these are not touch events. Like, so a desktop user or a pointing device user will continue to interact with this using the controls. But if you have a touch screen and our browser detects touch events, it's going to basically kind of totally override that behavior. Like, I'm not selecting text. I'm not moving the image around. I'm grabbing the slides and moving them left and right, which is pretty cool. Okay, that's going to do it for this lesson. We have successfully created our swiping gesture and allowed our slider component to adapt to both pointer events as well as touch events. We're going to continue to improve this a little bit more. I think we're almost done, but in the next lesson, I want to add a little bit of accessibility and keyboard support and just make sure that our visually impaired and accessible user interaction and experience is going to be just as good as touchscreens and pointing devices that we've set up here. So stay tuned. We'll check that out in just a moment.